Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldelder.com. I'm Brent and this is the unit focus video on Wraithblades. In these unit focus videos I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and tips for tactical play or how to play around those obstacles. Now, Wraithblades, like Wraithguard, are heavy infantry, and like Wraithguard, they are a bully unit. Now, what a bully unit is a unit that can bully its way into the midfield and either eliminate unprotected, more fragile enemy units, enemy target elimination units, or tie up enemy units in brutal hand-to-hand combat, maybe stop an enemy bully unit, some big tough monster or dangerous tank from bullying its way into the midfield. Wraithblades can go toe-to-toe with something like that. And lastly, a bully unit can just act as a deterrent. Sometimes all a bully unit really needs to do is to discourage enemy units from entering a certain part of the battlefield, maybe squatting on an objective and just saying, you are not allowed to pass within 18 inches of this point, not without serious consequences. Bully units are important. One of the jobs that they do is to keep pressure off your backline. And as a Craft Worlds player, generally you need one or two bully units because most of what we have is fast and fragile and glass cannony. And if you don't have a bully unit of your own, just about everything in your opponent's army that's even a little bit durable will be able to bully you. So you need something doing this job. So that's what Wraithblades are. They're a durable infantry unit that can contest a midfield objective, block enemy movement, that is, stop some big enemy baddie from bearing down on you, destroy enemy target elimination units, and perhaps even if they can get really onto your opponent's end of the table, really just start pushing your opponent around on their own turf, which is potentially super useful. And I think ultimately one of the most valuable jobs that this unit can do for you. Now, before I go any further, I need to acknowledge that if you are building the most optimal tournament list you can possibly build, and that is your goal, and that's what you're doing, and you're playing the kind of 40K where both players are not only trying to tactically outmaneuver one another on the table very carefully, but also are trying to tactically outmaneuver one another in list building, highly tactical, competitive 40K, which is a super fun way to play the game. It's how the game is typically played at tournaments. Not only is it not the only, it is not the only way to play the game, and it is not the way that the game, if we were to get everybody in this world who's played at least 5 games of 40K in the last year together in a big room, the vast majority of people would be playing a at least somewhat more casual version of the game. But oftentimes people who go online looking for tips and tricks and tactics are potentially thinking in these sort of tournament terms. And if that's where you are, I need to start by acknowledging that the Avatar of Cain and Wraithguard are the go-to bully units for competitive play. Wraithblades are good. They're very good. They're not a bad unit. They're not just like a narrative include. But the fact of the matter is that Wraithblades have nowhere near the damage output of Wraithguard, and although they can be trivially more durable, that slight durability boost comes nowhere near offsetting the difference in damage output. And it's for this reason that the Avatar and Wraithguard are they're the go-to picks for bully units in tournament lists. Both are more competitive. Wraithblades cost the same points as Wraithguard. They just they're not quite as efficient. Nevertheless, there are lots of really good reasons to include this unit in your list. They're not bad. They are competitive. They're I think a solid third option, slightly more distant third with Wraithguard and the Avatar in this bully unit role, but they're good. So like one reason to include them is that they play an important role, a role that you need and that they can do well. Other reasons include the models look really cool. They're old, you know, these things have been around for an age, but I think that they've stood the test of time better than most similarly old models in the game. I think a good piece of evidence is that all of the Wraith models are old, and yet newer players still look at Wraiths and think, I want to do a themed Aeldari list. I want it to be a Wraith list. I think Wraith lists are one of the most common theme builds for elf players, right? People who want a list that just instantly tells a story on the table when you look at it. People love these models. They've loved these models for a long time. They love the concept. Even if you're not doing like an all Wraith list, Just the concept of wraiths, right? These like undead ghost soldiers who have the spirit stones of dead Aeldari inserted into them so that they can continue fighting for the craft world after the death of their mortal bodies. That's a really grimdark, cool, badass, tragic idea. I personally really like the Ghost Sword Wraithblades, in part because I'm an Ibrasil player, and Howling Banshees are the big Ibrasil aspect shrine. And you've got to think that if you're a Howling Banshee and you die a horrible death fighting Tyranids and someone shoves your soul stone into a Wraith construct, you're probably going to end up as a Wraithblade with Ghost Swords, right? Like if your life path ended while you were a Banshee on the path of Cain, I've got to think that that's what you end up with as a, I don't know, and as an undead Wraith identity. So I like them for narrative reasons. But regardless of why you have decided to consider including Wraithblades in your list, you will run into the same obstacles and you will have access to the same advantages. So let's start talking about those. Okay, so we'll start with just a rundown of the datasheet and how you're going to build the unit out, I think. I'll do a couple of comparisons too with Wraithguard because I won't be able to stop myself. So Wraithblades have they have a heavy infantry stat line. They move 6, slightly slower than your average elf, but still quick. Toughness 7, that's really good. I love toughness 7 because that means that stuff that's strength 12, like a Bright Lance, still is wounding them on 3s, not 2s, which is going to extra matter when I talk about Far Seers and Fortune and stuff. And it also means that the vast majority of conventional weapons in the game are only going to wound them on 6s. Even stuff that's like, and this is because when you buff them with the Farseer using the Fortune ability, I'll talk about this later, this is going to be the result. They're going to be very difficult to wound, and then they've got a 2-up save, which is great. Terminator armor. If you aren't very familiar with Aeldari, you're kind of new to 40k and all you know is Space Marines because everybody knows Space Marines. Wraithblades and Wraithguard are kind of the Aeldari equivalent of Terminators. 2-up save is great. That means if they're in cover, something shooting them with -1 AP is still totally inconsequential. They're still saving on a 2-up. And they have 3 wounds. 3 wounds is so much better than 2 wounds. It's half as many wounds, but also it creates inefficiencies because there's a lot of stuff in the game that does flat 2 damage. There's quite a bit less stuff in the game that does flat 3 damage, especially stuff that's more than strength 7. There are certain factions that have, like weirdly, Tyranids and Chaos Space Marines have like a surprising number of things that do flat 3 with decent strength. But in general, 3 wounds is just like this awkward, annoying place for a target to be when you're trying to take it out. So they're very durable. In addition, if you build the Wraiths with the Axe and Force Shield, which is, I hate admitting this because I like the other model so much better, but it is the more competitive build. The Force Shield will give them a 4-up invulnerable save, which is the durability edge that they have over Wraithguard. That 4-up invulnerable save is not quite as clutch as it might sound initially, for the simple reason that it only really comes up if something has at least -3 AP, if it's like some kind of anti-tank. And at that point, it's probably only making a 1-point difference in the armor save, which matters, don't get me wrong. And if they're in cover and you're shooting at them, in order for the 4-up invuln to actually matter, the AP would have to be pretty extraordinary. Some of the highest AP in the game, like -4 and stuff. Nevertheless, a 2-up with a 4-up invuln that's pretty potent, especially on T7 when this is an infantry unit, and there are a bunch of them. They have a leadership value of 6+, pretty standard, an objective control of 1, which can be a little bit of a bummer if they're trying to contest an objective against a horde unit. But, 1 is what you expect. And then they don't have any shooting. They have 2 options for melee loadouts. One of those is Ghost Swords. They look so cool, right? They have 5 attacks with the Ghost Swords, hitting on 4s, not great, but you're going to run them with the Spirit Seer, which will offset that. Strength 6, pretty good. AP -2, 1 damage. Now, a unit of 5 Ghost Swords is obviously putting out like 25 attacks. A unit of 10 Ghost Swords is putting out 50 attacks. That's crazy. And they're going to wound stuff that's T3 on obviously a 2 up. So with those ghost swords, they're just going to be an absolute blender against any light infantry in the game. I'm going to assume light infantry is anything that has 1 wound and is less than toughness 5. They'll just chew through it. Now the Ghost Axe takes them from 5 attacks to 3 attacks, so considerably less, but it hits harder. They still only hit on 4s unless you've got them with the Spirit Seer, and you should always run them with the Spirit Seer. Strength 7, that's cool, that matters. It against lots of targets, it won't matter, right? Like against a Space Marine or an Imperial Guardsman, the Ghost Axe and the Ghost Swords are going to wound on the same sort of target numbers. But when the Wraithblades get engaged with something really tough, right? Something that's like T12 or something, the Ghost Axe can still crack that on a 5 up, and the Ghost Sword it's basically just shrugging that thing completely. So if you want this to be a bully unit that actually poses a threat to really tough tanks and monsters, you really do need the Ghost Axe rather than the Ghost Sword, I think. Because the Ghost Axe, in addition to that additional little bit of strength at a point that makes a difference, it still has the -2 AP, but it does flat 2 damage, so it's doing double damage. So anything that's multi-wound, the Ghost Axe will be more efficient into, even with the 3 attacks. And then the Ghost Swords are much more efficient into infantry. So in theory, maybe they would almost balance, and maybe if the current meta were all about hordes, if we were coming up against lots and lots of like endless swarm Tyrannid lists that were running 100 termagants and bringing a unit of 20 back every turn, maybe you would want the Ghost Swords. The problem is that's not the world we live in, and so not only are the Ghost Axes better at killing the kinds of things that are dominating the board in 10th edition, heavy infantry, monsters, tanks, but also they come with a 4-up and vulnerable save. So if there was any question at all, and there kind of wasn't really, the Force Shield takes you over the edge. I will say again, the Force Shield isn't, because if that 2-up save is really good, the Force Shield isn't quite as totally big as it might initially appear, in part because your opponent is not going to love targeting these things with things like bright lances and las cannons and stuff with really high AP, for the simple reason that this is why it's so great to have heavy infantry like this in your army, right? Because like if you shoot these things with something like a bright lance, there's a third of the shots are going to miss, and then if you buff them in the right ways, half the shots are going to fail to wound, and then half of the remaining shots will be saved, and you're going to be and then when you hit one, it doesn't matter if the bright lance does like 8 damage to it. Essentially the squad is damage gated so that each hit is and ends at 3 wounds. And so unless you're blasting these things with a weapon that does exactly 3 damage, it creates this great inefficiency. And the Force Shield against something like a bright lance or some powerful anti-tank weapon, even something like a star cannon, the Force Shield makes a small difference. Maybe you roll an extra save, and that adds some durability to the unit, and it's good. It matters, but also the axe is just better for the bully unit. I really wish that they had given the Ghost Swords like sustained hits, because with 50 attacks, right, sustained hits really might make a difference. Or there maybe someday when we have a Wraith Host detachment rules set, right, which I think we'll get when we eventually get a codex, but that's not happening in the next year, I don't think. Maybe they could do something, but at the moment it isn't really there. It isn't really there for the Ghost Swords. Now, lastly, the Wraithblades have the Malevolent Souls ability. This gives them a 50% chance, if they die in melee, of fighting on death if they've not already fought this phase. There are a lot of abilities in the 10th edition 40k that do this. It's fine. It's good. If they automatically fought on death, this would be like really pretty good, but it's just kind of okay. And the only reason that I find it a little bit frustrating is that the Wraithguard ability, their Wraith ability is so much exponentially better. And again, they cost the same points, and they already arguably have an edge with their weapon loadout. So Wraithguard have the same stat line, shooting weapons, but they also have a decent melee profile because they're big, strong ghost mechs, and then they have this war construct ability once per battle round. When an enemy targets this unit, after it's finished shooting, your Wraithguard can just shoot as though it was your shooting phase. So not like Overwatch hitting on sixes, just like straight up shooting. That's so powerful. That's definitely a lot better than Malevolent Souls. Malevolent Souls is fine. My only advice about Malevolent Souls is try not to forget that you have it. It's really easy to forget a power like that. Okay, so first takeaway here is you want the ghost axes and the force shields, probably not the swords. You can either take these in a squad of 5 at 170 points or a squad of 10 at 340 points. 340 is pretty considerable. I think you probably want 10. I really do. If you run them in 5s, their damage output, especially once one of them or two of them die, the damage output borders on inconsequential. They can't really spread out enough to block enemy movement the way you would want them to. They don't have enough presence on an objective to even really seriously contest it at all against anything, even with trivial OC. Also, once you start losing them, I think that if you're going to invest in them, you almost certainly want to take it to 10, and then you definitely need the Spirit Seer. Let's talk about the Spirit Seer. And we have to respect the fact the Spirit Seer is 65 points. So if you spent 340 on 10 of these things, the whole squad is coming to 405 points. You're getting within spitting distance of 25% of your army. This is a big, expensive tool. So it's really got to do some work for you in order to be worth having in your list. And this is one of the reasons why the Avatar of Cain is so popular, is because it's a lot cheaper, and it can kind of do the same job, arguably as well, or maybe even a little bit better. But the Spirit Seer is a necessary include because it makes the Wraiths even more durable, and it makes them hit harder. That 4-up weapon skill on a unit that's that expensive really hurts, and the Spirit Seer gives you a way around that. So if you stick a Spirit Seer in the squad, the Spirit Seer has like the standard Psyker stat line with the 7-inch elf move and the T3, 3 wounds, 4-up and vuln. No weapons to speak of that are in any way significant. I'm surprised that it doesn't have a smite equivalent as like a ranged shooting attack like the Warlocks do and like the Farseer does, but it just has a shuriken pistol, which is, yeah, that doesn't matter. It's got a witch staff, and the Spirit Seer that follows around your Wraith Guard is less likely to actually do any fighting than the Spirit Seer that's following around your Wraithblades. It's got 2 attacks. It hits on 2s and it wounds infantry on 2s, which is cool, and it does D3 damage, which is nice. But it's got 0 AP, so it's not like making a big difference in your as a model actually fighting. But here's what it does for the unit. It has the Spirit Mark ability, which gives all of the models in the unit +1 to hit, which is important. That's really important because it takes you from the 4 up to hit to the 3 up to hit. That's really substantial, and it gives you lethal hits. So 6s to hit will automatically wound. Now, you might be thinking, so Brent, you know those 50 attacks with the 10 ghost swords, that's a lot of 6s. That's a lot of auto wounds. You're not wrong. It's a lot of auto wounds with lethal hits. It's really solid. But I still think you're going to get a bunch of auto wounds with the axes too, right? They're putting out 30 attacks, not 50 attacks, but the axes do double damage. It doesn't. I wish the lethal hits got you there with the swords. It doesn't. If the swords also had sustained hits, or if there was some other trick or way to, it's neither here nor there. You still want the axes is the point. But lethal hits and +1 to hit is really good. And then the even bigger thing, Tears of Isha, in your command phase, you can put 1 destroyed model back into that unit. Now, if you just have the codex or the cards, you might look at this and see that it just says in the command phase, because when the codex dropped, you could actually resurrect one of these on both your turn and your opponent's turn. But that has since been FAQ'd. You cannot do that. You get a Wraithblade back in your own command phase. But that means that over the course of the game, you're likely to get 2 or 3 of these things back. So they're really expensive when you add the Spirit Seer in, but you have a little bit of recursion on that unit. They're pretty hard to eliminate. They're annoying for an opponent to deal with. And when one of them is just coming back to life every time you have a command phase, that's even more annoying for your opponent. So the build you want is the Spirit Seer, and then 10 with the axes and shields. And then the other thing you need to think about is your Farseer, because Wraithblades have fabulous synergy with the Farseer. I think actually kind of like a necessary synergy with the Farseer. Firstly, because of that fortune ability that I mentioned in passing before. Your Farseer on the first turn is probably putting fortune on the Wraithblades, who on turn 1 are going to move out into the midfield and start doing their thing, and that makes them -1 to wound. And I alluded to this before. Well, I just straight up said it. That means that the majority of weapons in the game are going to be wounding these things on 6s, and even stuff that's like really powerful anti-tank super weapon stuff is generally still only going to be wounding them on 4s. There are some weapons in the game, like strength 16 or whatever, that are still going to wound them on 3s. But for the most part, your opponent's going to be hitting these things on 3s, wounding them at best on 4s, probably on 5s, and then you're still going to have the 4-up invuln with them, and you're going to be bringing one back each turn. So they're really resource intensive to eliminate if you put fortune on them. They're already resource intensive to eliminate, but especially on the first turn of the game while your opponent still has all of his or her toys, having fortune on there can really make a big difference. So when you're deploying, you want to make sure you deploy close enough to the Farseer that the Farseer can, in the command phase, pick the Wraithblades as the target for fortune. There's one more reason that you want to have the Farseer nearby, and this is a good moment to transition to talking about obstacles to playing these things well, and how best to play around those obstacles. So the biggest obstacle to using Wraithblades effectively is that by elf standards, they appear slow. They have a movement of 6, they have no shooting weapons, and you can't put them in a transport effectively, because the only thing you could theoretically put them in is a wave serpent, but you could only put 5 in there, and that makes the whole unit way too expensive. And wave serpents just they're not competitively pointed at the moment, so you're not going to do that. We don't currently have a stratagem like we've had in previous editions that lets you just like teleport in, so they have to be foot sloggers, and there's no trick to make them advance or charge or anything like that. So the fact that they're a slow unit by elf standards that has to leg it is an issue, and they're not as quick as the avatar. So here's how you play around that. These things, so Wraithblades can actually be shockingly fast. Here's how. Step 1, you want to deploy these things as close to the front of your deployment zone as you can. Now, in tournament play, in the vast majority of tournament play, serious tournament play, the first floors of buildings that are in your deployment zone are opaque where they face the enemy deployment zone. It doesn't matter how the terrain is modeled, whether it has windows or whatever. The first floor of buildings within your deployment zone are considered opaque. And at a lot of stores and at a lot of casual play, people just play this way also because it is the most fair. It is a more fair way to play the game. It leads to better, more balanced outcomes. This has been shown through thousands and thousands of reps of the game. It's a good way to do things. So presuming that you are playing this way, and even if you're not, like, it's good to try to have terrain in your deployment zones when you're setting your board up that has opaque first floors so that people can hide their stuff. So you want you want your wraiths as close to the front of your deployment zone as they can be, but out of line of sight of your opponent. And ideally, this is going to be in a building positioned in this way that I just described. You want the Farseer close enough to them that you can put fortune on them at the beginning. And ideally, actually, you want the Farseer like right up with them for a reason that I will get to in just a moment. On your turn, you start by making an advance move with the Wraithblades. Now, they run straight through the wall of the building because they're infantry, and therefore they can do that with the breaching ability. And although they only move 6 because they don't have a shooting weapon at all, on any turn that you know that they're not going to charge, just think of their movement as 6 plus a d6, which is suddenly much better because there's no reason for them not to advance. Now, you could guarantee that they advance 6 inches with a stratagem. There might be rare occasions in which it makes sense to do this, but generally don't. The other thing you can do is use a fate die to advance them 12 inches. And if you have a Farseer nearby, you can treat one of your fate dice of 1 or 2 as a 6. And you can do that once per phase. So you're probably not competing with anything else that really needs to do that on turn 1. So they're going to be able to move 12 inches out of the gate on turn 1, but actually they're going to kind of move 13 inches. And this is because the Spirit Seer has a movement characteristic of 7. And if you put the Spirit Seer close to the front of the unit and you have the Spirit Seer move 13 inches and all of the Wraiths move 12 inches, they'll still be in squad coherency. So the whole squad in terms of its reach has moved 13 inches. And then on your opponent's turn, at the end of your opponent's movement phase, you can use Phantasm to move them another 7 inches so that they have essentially moved 20 inches on turn 1. Or, alternatively, if you really need it to happen on your turn, you could use Fire and Fade, which no longer requires you to actually fire. Thank you, Mike, on my Discord for pointing this out. To simply pay 2 CP and move 20 inches. So they move the 13 inches, use the Fire and Fade stratagem, which gives them a 7-inch move because of the Spirit Seer. So they go 20 inches on your turn. You could also theoretically do both. If you have an Autarch in your list that you have made your Warlord, you'll get 2 CP on your turn, 1 on your opponent's turn. If you were to do both, it would cost you all 3 CP, but you'd be moving 27 inches on the first turn of the game. At that point, you're basically in your opponent's deployment zone on turn 1 with fortune, at least until the end of that turn. Now, if they actually end up continuing to do a job in the midfield, it's nice if you can keep the Farseer out of line of sight and safe and move it up so he can keep putting fortune on them or she can keep putting fortune on them. That would be great. It's kind of okay if it doesn't happen, because now you have a choice, right? You can either use that crazy movement trick to get onto an objective, to spread out the squad to like block an avenue of movement between a couple of buildings so your opponent can't get through with tanks and monsters, and you have some midfield objective that you're scoring from the beginning of the game that you really need, that you're denying your opponent, and you're just being a deterrent in a certain part of the field. Like, that's awesome. That's a great way to use them. The other thing you could do is simply catapult them directly into your opponent's face with that 20 or 27-inch move in the first turn of the game, and then just like get into your opponent's backfield and create a logjam, maybe contest their backfield objective, tie a bunch of stuff up in melee. And Wraithblades they're not big killers. They're really good at killing infantry, but they're not like, especially once you've lost a bunch of them, they're not major target elimination units. That's not really why they're there. They're not going to like destroy your opponent's super heavy tanks or wipe out their Terminator squads or whatever. But what they are going to do is prevent your opponent from maneuvering and using their toys the way they want to maneuver and use their toys. And that is just fabulous. And while your opponent is putting resources into eliminating the Wraithblades, which your opponent is going to have to do, a lot of the rest of your army will be able to move around either unmolested or significantly less molested than it would have been. It still takes experience and finesse to know where to position them. Do I block an objective? Do I go for an objective? Do I get into my opponent's backfield? What do I prioritize doing? That's finesse stuff that just requires saddle time and experience and knowledge of your opponent's units. But I think if you use the movement shenanigans, probably anybody can feel good about this unit, like have it do pretty well for them, more or less out of the gate. You just have to have reasonable expectations and understand that this is a bully unit. They're not killers. They're not going to be as efficient at killing stuff as a lot of the other units in your army, because that isn't their job. Okay, so there are 3 potential vulnerabilities here. One is if you're trying to get into your opponent's backfield or whatever and get in your opponent's face and play with them like a wrecking ball that you launch at your opponent, a very fast maneuverable army may just be able to like go around them kind of avoid them to a certain degree. This, generally speaking, like bully units that don't have any shooting are prone to simply being ignored and avoided by a maneuverable opponent. That's certainly what I do as a Craft Worlds player with a highly maneuverable army. When I come up against a bully unit I don't want to deal with that doesn't shoot, you just avoid it. So if that's the case, you want to make sure that you have stuff that synergizes with the Wraithblades. If your opponent can just get around you with maneuverable stuff, make sure you have enough target elimination, very powerful target elimination units that you can punish your opponent if they suddenly try to jump into your backfield. A unit that doesn't see a ton of top level competitive play at this point that nevertheless synergizes surprisingly well with Wraithblades is D cannons. A couple of D cannons with their pretty limited 24-inch range can be great. I mean, that's a really powerful, really hard hitting weapon. It's just pretty limited at 24 inches. It's at -1 for the indirect fire, but it has the heavy keyword, so if you don't move it, it still hits on 3-ups. And if you have a couple of these things, like if your opponent moves into your backfield to avoid your wraiths, now it's getting like blasted with a couple of the most heavy support platforms in the game, and there's kind of nothing that wants to be shot with something like that. And there are other options too. Just make sure you have a plan for if your opponent just kind of goes around them. Another difficulty you can run into with the Wraithblades is if you come up against units with a lot of objective control, and what you're trying to do with the Wraithblades is control an objective. If your opponent kills like 3 or 4 of them, even if you're bringing one back on your turn, you end up with like an OC of 6 with the Spirit Seer, or 7 on the objective, and your opponent engages you with a squad that has an OC value of 2 and is like a big infantry squad. Potentially you can still get over pressured. Remember, don't forget that you have a stratagem that lets you fall back, shoot, and charge. So if your opponent gets into melee with your Wraithblades with something that has better OC, you can always fall back with the Wraithblades, shoot the thing, charge it again with the Wraithblades, and finish it off. The other thing you can do is follow up with something like a unit of Swooping Hawks. Swooping Hawks are cheap. I think they're about 75 points. I think that's right. To just something else quick that can like jump onto the objective and add an extra OC of 5 or whatever if you need to just sort of barely overpower your opponent. Also, think about how you position the wraiths on the objective or just in front of the objective. There's like a way, if you're playing with those big objective markers, which I think you should be, that shows not just the objective itself, but like the big marker that shows the area of effect of the objective, like where you have to be to control it. You can kind of like fan the Wraithblades out to make it almost impossible for your opponent to get bases onto the objective at all. See if you can literally screen them off of the objective. Don't just pile the whole unit with their bases tight together in the middle of the objective. Like really think about how you position the models. If you're a veteran player, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but newer players make that type of mistake a great deal. The last, I think, big vulnerability of the unit is that it really does rely on the Spirit Seer for the resurrection ability and to improve its damage output. And although the Spirit Seer has an incredibly powerful bodyguard in the 10 Wraith Guard, the Spirit Seer is vulnerable to snipers, stuff that has precision. It has 3 wounds, right? So generally sniper units or sniper characters in the game are kind of tripped out to be able to kill an officer with 3 wounds. They're not going to like one-shot a Space Marine captain or whatever, but they will one-shot potentially a Space Marine lieutenant or something like an Aeldari Spirit Seer. So you need to make sure that you're like, if your opponent has something like that in their army, think about keeping the Spirit Seer out of line of sight if possible. The other thing you can do is to try to make a point of eliminating whatever it is threatens the Spirit Seer. Your other option is to give the Spirit Seer the Phoenix Gem, which is a not super expensive piece of war gear that on a 2-up will let the Spirit Seer resurrect if killed by sniper fire. I think... Oh, and it will do so with full wounds remaining. If you know that you're going to come up against this kind of thing in your meta, it might make sense to give your Spirit Seer the Phoenix Gem. If not, don't. Like, I love giving the Phoenix Gem to either my Farseer, if I don't want it being killed by indirect fire, or my Autarch Wayleaper, for reasons that I think I talked about when I did the video on Autarch Wayleapers. But it is something to keep in mind, and some of you out there really might need to consider building the squad with the Phoenix Gem, depending on what kind of meta you're playing in or what kind of tournaments you're going to. And lastly, know what your opponent's stuff does, right? For the most part, you can be really bullish with your Wraithblades, but there are units in the game that with like -3 or 4 AP have a ton of attacks in melee and can do flat 3 damage, and that is one place where you want to be careful. So if your opponent does have something that really could threaten the Wraithblades, like maybe nearly wipe them in a turn, certainly if they're fighting in both rounds of combat, then you want to blast that thing out of the water with bright lances or fire prisms or whatever else before you make the 20-inch move with your Wraithblades, and then make the 20-inch move with your Wraithblades. And that's about target priority and knowing what the things in your opponent's list can do. Okay, so that's really what I've got. If you have your own ideas about how to use Wraithblades effectively, please mention those in the comments below. If you just want to click a like, I appreciate that. If you haven't already subscribed, I hope you'll subscribe. Also, the Discord. I have a Discord that is fabulous. People are very active. There are a variety of types of players. If you want to get involved with that, you can become a patron. It's only $3 a month. I really appreciate it. You also get early access to some content and some other benefits as well. I hope to be back very soon with my annual Farseers report, in which I talk about what's to come in the months ahead. Until then, best of luck with your space elves, and I will look forward to talking to you all again soon.